In this session I want to talk about the macro environment and how it impinges on an organization. By macro environment we mean all of the influences that are outside of the business. These are the big influences coming from the economy, coming from the government, coming from international trade and international agreements. Big influences that are outside of the business but nonetheless impact on the business. We call these the macro environment. The micro environment, by way of contrast, is what is inside the business. So we're going to look at the macro, all of the big issues from outside of the business and how they can be brought to bear on the business, how they affect the business. And we do this through what's known as a Pestle analysis. You'll see in some books it's called simply Pest. In other books it's called Pestle. It's an anagram, and we're going to work our way through each of the terms to see how the terms may be used to group ideas about the external environment and their impact on the organization. The anagram simply stands for P for political, so we look at all of the political influences and list them all out. E is for economic, again do the same. S for social or socio-cultural. T for technological. L for legal. And E for environmental. So each of the letters is a mnemonic for some environmental set of factors. So that's the idea. The idea is to look at each of these, and we're just simply going to get into it. By the way, I said it's a Pestle analysis. It's not really an analysis as such. It's more a way of classifying influences under headings. It groups all of the political under one heading. It's not really an analysis as such. It may be used for the company to take each of the points listed and analyze how those points affect the business. If it is explaining how the various macro points affect the business, then that is an analysis. But the simple act of classifying it under the headings is not an analysis. That's just a listing process. So if the points are used to show how they affect the business, then that would be an analysis. Anyway, let's look at it. It's a method used by companies when conducting a strategy or a strategic analysis of the business. When it's looking at strategy. So it is important because it talks about the business, and it talks about the business in the context of these wider environmental influences. The aim of the analysis is to provide relevant information about the company's external environment, the macro environment in which the company operates. So the main emphasis here is to try to link the company to the macro environment, to see how the macro environment, the wider influences, influence the company. Now, I've said already what Pestle was, or is. Then we can do that schematically like that. We can say there's the organization in the center, and the political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, legal, environmental parts to the world in which we live all impact on the organization. So that's what we're going to do. And what we're going to do now is to simply look at each one of these in turn, briefly, and to indicate what sort of influences could be grouped under each of the headings. We'll start with political, and so we'll just list a list of political influences, and then as to whether they are useful in explaining the organisation. That would be subsequent analysis, but not analysis we're going to do here ourselves. We're just going to simply say these are possible influences. So when we look at political, we could say, well, there are all sorts. I've just listed 8 here. You'll find in your researches perhaps additional ones or whatever. But if you read down through the 8, you'll get the idea of what these wider influences are. For example, trading policies between countries. How do countries deal with each other, and do they impose tariffs and restrictions on imports, and do they subsidize exports, and exactly what are the trading policies? That's the point. What are the government policies towards the business? It's taxation policy. What employment laws are in existence? The individual business can't do anything about the employment laws, but it should write it down and be aware of it and recognize that it does impact on the business. So what are the employment laws? What are the rights of workers? What are the rights of the consumer protection issues? As I said, what's the current and what's the likely future taxation policy? Corporate taxes or value-added taxes, or what is the likely course of taxes in the next X years? And I also could look at war and conflict and terrorism and see what the relationship with the business is. How will this affect the business? Will it affect the business? And what trading bodies exist? For example, to regulate trade, we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We have free trade areas. We have the European Union. We have ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We have the North American Free Trade Area, and so on. We also have grants and funding that may come from the government, that may become available from the government in the future to perhaps subsidize training for workers or whatever. So these are wide political influences that may affect the business and are worth noting. Now let's look at the economic. Well, the overall condition of the economy is important. The infrastructure, the number of people out of work, tax revenues, government borrowing, interest rates. All of these are important in trying to explain how the external conditions affect the business. If you look at number 2, I mentioned interest rates, inflation, exchange rates. Again, key indicators. And these would have to be interpreted and understood in the context of the business, but they may have an impact. What's the level of unemployment? Is there social unrest in the country? What's the growth rate, or what's the level of GDP, gross domestic product? And how is it changing over time? Is the country growing, or is it stagnant? Is it in recession? Is it depressed? What's the level of customer or consumer and government spending? Is that depressed? What are the production levels in the country? What's the rate of economic growth? And what's the likely future for economic growth in the country? And also, what entry barriers exist in the particular business itself? Entry barriers are really outside of the company, because entry barriers are trying to block companies external to the business from entering and competing away its profits. So what entry barriers exist? And what's the level of disposable income? Have customers got enough disposable income to buy the product? and what's the likely to happen to that in the future. Now, these are just some of the possible economic influences on the business that are worth noting. The socio-cultural ones, well, there are ethical issues about, for example, corporate social responsibility. Companies should not pollute the atmosphere, and health and safety issues. And I'll talk about these down further, but there are all sorts of issues. How does it treat its workers? Where does it get its supplies from? And does it pay workers a sufficient living wage? Not only workers in the country, but perhaps if it buys in raw materials or semi-processed goods or whatever from other countries, is it paying the workers sufficient in those countries as well? What's the population? What's the lifestyle changes in the population? How are we living now compared to in the past? And what's the likely future course of the changes that we have in our lifestyles? Perhaps we're moving from owner-occupied houses to rented houses. Perhaps we're not buying cars, but we're leasing them. Perhaps. So these were influences that should be taken into account. What are the demographics of the country? What's the age structure? What's the gender divide? Is it an aging population, or is it a young population? Because they all have different impacts on the business, perhaps. What's the education in the country? Is it a strong education system? Is it weak? Do people participate at school? What language barriers are there? There may be many languages within the country which may be holding back economic growth because the people can't communicate with each other. Or what are the language barriers in international trade? If the company is trading internationally, does it have the language skills to do that effectively? What are the customer attitudes and preferences towards the product, or towards the company, or towards business in general? And there are health and safety issues, and the type of living standards that people have got, which influence health and safety, or particularly health. If the workers don't have a lot of disposable income, they may not have good diets, and therefore they can't work effectively, and they can't concentrate. So there are all sorts of issues that may affect the business which are outside. The organization culture and the people's attitude to work. What is the organization's culture? And what are people's attitude to work? Perhaps people don't want to work very hard, or don't want to apply themselves very hard. Perhaps there isn't a work ethic within the country, a strong work ethic. What are the trends in society? Not just fashion, but broad trends, lifestyle trends. What's important to people? And all of these issues impact on the business, and the management of the business must at least recognize that those influences are out there. They may not all be relevant to the business. There may be additional ones, as I said, that I haven't listed here that are relevant. But the point is that the management should be aware of these and should be able to itemize them. Technological factors. Well, what's the existing and future innovation, invention trends? That's important. We don't live in a world where it's stagnant, where we have the same products year in, year out. The products are changing. And in fact, it could be argued over the last couple of decades have changed dramatically. What's the general level of funding for research and development? what's happening at universities in terms of research and development. And what sort of research and development is it? Is it primary, or is it survey type work looking at attitudes of the population? Or is it scientific? What sort of research and development? What sort of global communications are there in place to facilitate international trade? And if it's a period of rapid innovation, then machines will become obsolete very quickly. Existing technologies will become obsolete because of the rate of technological change. The internet has changed the world and will probably continue to do so, and do so at a never increasing rate. And nobody's surprised at the innovations that seem to be worked out on the internet and are made available to the users on almost a daily basis. People have ceased to be surprised. It is now an expectation it will change. We've also got waste disposal and recycling, which are now big issues in the country. People are more conscious of recycling, the importance of using the same products many times to save on the Earth's resources. And also, of course, there is transport, which is changing as well. All of these, and more, perhaps when you do your research you'll find more, as I said on the previous slide. All of these need to at least be listed. Some of them may not be relevant to the business, some may. And if they are relevant to the business, then an analysis may be conducted. But initially, they should simply be brainstormed and written down as possible influences. The legal environment, well, there's always the impact of legislation, health and safety, and employment, and even issues on global warming, on the environment. But the business also has to be careful about the future legislation and how it will impact on the business. So it should be aware of what the political parties are saying, what their plans are for the next X years, the next 10 years, let's say. So it should be listening, because changes in policy will affect the business. And also trading policies. What's likely to be the case of changing trading policies, trading within, say, a trading bloc, say within the European Union, or trading with other countries outside of the European Union. What are the legal implications? Sometimes contracts may be drawn up with the country, but that country is suddenly accused of terrorism, let's say, and the government says the company can no longer trade with that country. Well, that could be a big effect on the business. Forgetting everything else, just simply a big effect on the business. We're down to environmental. Pollution levels, global warming considerations, these are important because they may affect the business through later on having to pay for the pollution, or the government may pass legislation to stop pollution and the business may be accused of being a polluter. But also looking at the importance of recycling, not just from a global perspective, but also as one that shows the customer that the company has got green credentials. It is trying hard to recycle and be kind to the environment. The government, media and consumer views and opinions of the environment are important, and these should be taken into account, because what they say may become law in the future and may impact on the balance sheet of the business. And also also legislation, of course. As I said to you earlier, legislation may vary in the future in all sorts of ways, and it may be legislation about the environment, it may be legislation related to the environment loosely, but it may impact on the business, and it should be taken into account. So essentially what Pestle is doing is it's taking these headings and trying to list out what influences come under each of the headings, and if the influences seem to relate to the business in some obvious manner, then some analysis could be done to explain how the influences influence the business and what measures can be taken to sidestep any adverse effects, or indeed what steps can be taken to exploit any advantage that these conditions would bring. So it's sidestepping the disadvantages that may be out there and exploiting the advantages. So Pestle is just a list of these headings, and it's worth doing some research on this, going back over notes, slides here, making a note of them, and doing some research online to see that a full list can be worked out. Long lists may not all apply to a particular business, but it's worth noting it's easier to delete them, to try and just in case one is missed completely, and it may have an impact in the future. So having a long list is not a bad thing. So do some research on that, and really that's all I need to do on this session. So thank you for watching.